I only agreed to the 9 o'clock meeting because my creative director had already rescheduled it twice, and I was tired of seeing the same red reminder on my calendar. I expected a nervous founder, a vague collection deck, and 45 minutes of pretending the phrase quiet luxury still meant anything. I didn't expect the man who walked into our conference room carrying someone else's presentation to become the reason I stopped treating my life like a plan I had already failed to follow. He arrived 7 minutes late, damp from the March rain, with a flat black portfolio tucked under one arm and 2 coffee cups balanced in his other hand. He wore a dark green over a white t-shirt, black trousers, and the expression of someone who had spent the entire elevator ride rehearsing an apology. "Daniel?" I asked, standing from the table. He shifted both coffees into one hand so he could shake mine. "Daniel Mercer. I'm sorry. Maya was supposed to be here." I guessed that when you said Daniel. For half a second he looked startled. Then he laughed, and the tension around his mouth eased. "She woke up with a fever," he said. "She tried to convince me she could still come, which was how I knew she definitely couldn't. I'm only here to make sure you have the collection notes and answer whatever I can." He held out one of the coffees. "Maya said you take it black. That's either thoughtful or unsettling. She researched everyone in the meeting. Unsettling, then?" His smile was quick and quiet. "Probably." The meeting was for a small independent label called Alder and Ash. Maya had started it 3 years earlier with a line of simple linen separates, then expanded carefully into tailored pieces made in limited runs. The clothes were good, the brand around them was not. Its website sounded like 6 different people had written it. The campaign images had no relationship to each other, and its social captions alternated between overly sincere essays and one-word descriptions in capital letters. My agency had been asked to build the creative direction for a fall capsule, campaign concept, collection name, launch language, lookbook copy, and a short film script. It was the kind of project I usually liked. There was enough structure to keep it moving and enough ambiguity to make the work interesting. Daniel opened the portfolio and spread the sketches across the conference table. The collection was built around coats, soft tailoring, and layered pieces in slate blue, tobacco brown, cream, and a muted rust that reminded me of old brick after rain. The drawings were confident without being showy. Every look had small handwritten notes beside it, hidden pocket deep enough for a paperback, cuff can be folded without losing line, shoulders should feel held but not restricted. I picked up the sketch of a long charcoal coat. These notes are more specific than the brand brief. They're not really for the brand. Who are they for? He hesitated. Me, mostly. I looked at him, then back at the page. You designed these. His fingers rested on the edge of the portfolio. Most of them. Maya said she was bringing her designer. She was. But you said you were only here to deliver the notes. I didn't think my work history was relevant to the meeting. It's a meeting about your work. Another small smile appeared, though this one looked less amused. When you put it that way. I asked him to walk me through the collection from the beginning. At first he answered like someone filling in for a friend, concise and careful. Then I asked why so many pieces had adjustable closures instead of fixed shapes. And something changed. He leaned over the sketches, using his hand to trace the line of a jacket without touching the paper. Because people don't stay one shape all day, he said. They sit, they eat, they carry things, they get cold, they want to loosen a layer without looking like the garment stopped working. I don't like clothes that only make sense when someone is standing still for a photograph. That was the first sentence he said without checking how it would sound. I asked another question, then another. He told me the collection had started with the idea of returning to something without pretending you were the same person who had left it. The fabrics were familiar, but the cuts were different. Traditional coat shapes had softer structures. Formal trousers had hidden stretch. Shirts could be tied, tucked, or left loose without looking unfinished. Clothes for people who changed their minds? I asked. Clothes for people who changed, he said. The line stayed with me. By the time our creative director, Elias, joined us, Daniel had moved from the chair across from me to the one beside the presentation screen. He spoke more confidently when he was discussing construction, but every time the conversation turned to his role, he stepped backward from it. Elise noticed too. You should be part of the creative workshops, she said when we reached the timeline slide. Daniel glanced toward the closed conference room door as if Maya might recover, appear in the hallway, and rescue him. Maya will handle the brand decisions. She should, Ellie said. But Noah needs the person who understands why the clothes exist. I watched him absorb that. His thumb moved once along the corner of the portfolio. I can make myself available, he said. It sounded like a concession, not an opportunity. We finished the meeting just before 11. Daniel gathered the sketches into precise stacks, thanked us twice, and refused the umbrella I offered because he said the train station was only 3 blocks away. At the door, I asked, "How long have you worked with Maya?" He adjusted the portfolio under his arm. "On and off since she started. And before that, I worked for a few larger labels." The answer was technically complete and clearly designed to end the subject. I let it. "Send me your availability," I said. "We'll start with a concept session next week." He nodded. "I'll check with Maya." I asked for your availability. His gaze met mine. There was a pause, not long enough to be dramatic, but long enough for me to notice. "Right," he said. "I'll send it." After he left, Elise stood beside me and looked through the glass wall toward the elevators. "Well," she asked. "The collection has a point of view. We can work with it." I meant the designer. So did I. She gave me the look she used when she knew I was avoiding something and had decided not to make it her problem yet. At 27, I had become very good at answering the question I preferred instead of the one someone had actually asked. It was a skill I had carried out of a 6-year relationship and a 4-month engagement. Rachel used to call it my courtroom voice. She would ask whether I wanted to move to Connecticut, and I would explain why Boston made more sense. She would ask about children, and I would say I could imagine being a father someday. None of those answers were lies. That was what made them dangerous. She had known I was bisexual before our second date and had never treated it as a threat. We loved each other. But while we planned the wedding, our future began moving faster than my consent to it. Rachel wanted a house near her family, a short engagement, and children soon. I wanted her, but I wanted every decision several years later than she did. We spent months negotiating around the truth. Finally, she said she would not persuade me into a life I might resent, and I said I would not make her wait for certainty I could not promise. We returned the venue deposit, divided our things, and told people we had grown in different directions. It was accurate and far too neat for how it felt to lose someone I still respected. Daniel emailed his availability that afternoon. His message was brief and professional. He could come to Boston on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He was available by video the other days. He attached a folder of construction notes, fabric references, and old campaign images that had influenced the collection. At the bottom, beneath his name, he had added one line, "I'm sorry again about taking over Maya's meeting." "She claims the fever made her irresponsible." I wrote back. "Tell her the fever improved her delegation skills." His reply arrived less than a minute later. She says, "That is the nicest thing anyone has ever said about her management style." That was how it started. Not with a confession or a look across a crowded room. With an email thread that should have ended after 2 messages and didn't. Our first workshop took place the following Tuesday in Alder and Ash's South End studio. Maya attended wrapped in an oversized scarf, drinking tea from a mug that said, "Teach IS meeting COULDHAVEBEENANEMAIL." She made decisions quickly. Daniel quietly explained the sketches whenever she handed them to him. We covered the walls with references. Ellis wanted transformation. Maya wanted the collection grounded. Daniel rejected anything that made clothing sound like therapy. "What about return?" I asked, not going backward, returning with more information. "Return to what?" Maya asked. "Yourself, a place, work you left, something familiar that fits differently now." Daniel's eyes stayed on me a second longer than necessary. By lunch, we had a concept. The collection became "After the Weather," a phrase from the margin of one of Daniel's sketches. The campaign would follow people resuming ordinary city routines after change. No dramatic rebirth, Daniel said, just being able to live in your own life again. I wrote it on the board. "That wasn't copy," he said. "It might be." Over the next 2 weeks, our meetings found a rhythm. I wrote the narrative. Daniel corrected every idea that required a coat to behave in a way coats did not behave. He also began bringing cardamom buns, soup, and eventually black coffee placed beside my laptop without asking. You remembered. Maya researched everyone. That excuse worked once. Maybe I also have a functioning memory. His dry humor often arrived a second before I recognized it. I started looking for the smile that followed. The first time we worked alone was not planned. Maya had a production call. Ellis left for a client dinner. The photographer canceled a review because his child was sick. At 6:30, the alder and ash studio emptied around us until only the sound of rain against the tall windows remained. Daniel stood at the large cutting table arranging fabric swatches on a presentation board. I sat with my laptop at the other end, trying to shorten the campaign statement without making it sound like a bank advertisement. We had been working for nearly an hour when I noticed he had moved the same 3 swatches at least 4 times. The cream wool went left, then right, then back beneath the rust cotton where it had started. He reached for a roll of tape, caught the edge of a pencil cup, and sent 2 markers rolling across the table. "You okay?" I asked. "Perfectly." He said it too quickly. I closed my laptop halfway. "You've been reorganizing those since I started rewriting the second paragraph. The composition is difficult. It's 3 rectangles. That's why every decision matters." I stood and walked around the table. As I came beside him, he straightened slightly, keeping his attention on the board. The tips of his ears had turned pink. There were ordinary explanations. He had been away from professional design work for almost a year. This was his first major campaign since returning. We were close to presenting the concept to a client he cared about, but he had been calm 10 minutes earlier when I was sitting 6 feet away. I leaned one hand against the edge of the table and smiled. "You're getting nervous." His hand stopped above the cream swatch. For one brief second, he looked at me as if I had caught him doing something much more serious than dropping a marker. His eyes moved over my face, then returned to the board. A small smile pulled at one corner of his mouth. "I'm used to working alone." That explains the silence, not why you moved the same fabric 4 times. "Maybe I'm reconsidering the composition." "Of course you are." He gave a quiet laugh. I stayed beside him, close enough that our sleeves nearly touched. He didn't step away, neither did I. The moment lasted only a few seconds before my phone vibrated against the table. I looked down automatically. It was a message from Rachel about the last box of books still in her sister's garage. When I looked back, Daniel had moved to the other side of the board. We finished the work by 8. He left for the train with the fabric samples packed beneath his arm and the same careful expression he had worn after our first meeting. On my walk home, I replayed the scene more times than I wanted to admit. I had dated men before Rachel. I had dated women before and after those men. Attraction was not new or confusing to me, but I had not expected to feel it so soon after the engagement ended, and I had definitely not expected it in the middle of a client presentation board. I told myself I was reacting to the intimacy of creative work. Daniel and I had spent hours translating his private ideas into public language. That kind of collaboration could feel personal even when it wasn't. Then he texted me at 9:14. "You were right about the cream swatch. It looked better the first way." I stared at the message and smiled. I wrote back, "I'll try to be gracious about this historic admission." He replied, "Please don't. It would be out of character." The next Thursday, the project team had dinner after a successful concept review. We went to a crowded Italian place near the studio where the tables were too close together and every conversation sounded public. Daniel sat beside me. Maya sat across from us, still answering emails between bites of pasta. Elise arrived late with Julia, one of our account directors, who had attended my engagement party the previous fall. Halfway through dinner, Julia asked, "Have you heard from Rachel? I keep meaning to check in with her." The conversation around the table softened in that immediate, awkward way it did when people remembered something sad in the middle of a good evening. "Last week," I said. "We're sorting out the final apartment stuff." Julia touched my wrist. "I'm sorry. I know I already said that, but still." It's okay. What happened? Maya asked. Daniel glanced at her. What? She said. I met him after the engagement ended. You also met him 3 weeks ago, Daniel said. I ask efficient questions. I laughed, grateful for the interruption. We wanted different lives. No scandal. No secret second family. Boring, Maya said, tragically. Julia gave her a look, but I was still smiling. Beside me, Daniel had gone very still. Until that moment, I had not considered what he knew about my personal life. There were no photographs of Rachel on my desk, but several people at the agency had asked about her in front of him. My engagement had been public in the ordinary way office news was public. There had been a party, photographs, and months of casual references to wedding planning. Daniel didn't ask anything. He finished his dinner, joined the conversation when someone addressed him, and left early to catch his train. At the restaurant door, I said, "You're coming Tuesday?" He adjusted his scarf. "Maya will be there." I asked if you were coming. His eyes flicked to mine, and for a moment I saw the same expression from the studio table, open, startled, quickly hidden. "Yes," he said, "I'll be there." But something changed after that dinner. It was subtle enough that I spent several days wondering whether I had invented it. Daniel still answered messages, he still joined the meetings, he still remembered my coffee. But the extra conversations disappeared. He stopped staying after Maya left. If our hands reached for the same sketch, he withdrew first. He was never cold. Daniel was too considerate to punish someone for a feeling they had not asked him to have. He simply became precise, professional. It irritated me more than it should have. Our campaign moved forward. The client approved the concept. A photographer was booked. Locations were chosen: an old train platform, a laundromat with large front windows, a narrow city street lined with brick buildings, and Daniel's unused workroom in Providence. The workroom had been his suggestion. It was on the second floor of a former jewelry factory, with tall windows and worn wooden floors. He still paid rent on it, though he had barely used it in months. "You kept a studio for a year without working?" I asked during a planning call. "I worked. Just not on collections." "What did you work on?" "Repairs. A few custom pieces, avoidance." Maya laughed from her square on the screen. "Mostly avoidance." Daniel didn't argue. The location scout took place on a gray Saturday in Providence. Maya was supposed to join us, but a delayed shipment kept her in Boston. Daniel met me outside the train station wearing a navy coat I recognized from one of his older photographs. "You made that," I said instead of hello. He looked down at himself. "Several years ago." "It still looks good. It has a hidden inside pocket big enough for a paperback." I would have been disappointed otherwise. The smile he gave me was cautious but real. We spent the morning moving through locations, then ate at a diner near the river with red booths and mismatched mugs. "This is where you bring all your creative strategists?" I asked. "Only the difficult ones." He told me he had moved to Providence after design school and later worked for a Boston label before consulting for smaller brands. "What made you stop?" He folded his straw wrapper into a square. "I got good at making things I didn't care about. More money, more responsibility, and people asking for the same coat in a new color because the first one sold." "What happened before you quit?" "I stopped sleeping. I hated every sketch before I finished it. My boyfriend said I talked about fabric like it had personally betrayed me." There it was, one ordinary reference to a man he had loved. My pulse changed anyway. "Were you together long?" 3 years. We ended before I left the job." "Because of the job?" "Not only. But I was difficult to live with." "Past tense." He laughed. "Optimistic of you." Daniel had not hidden his sexuality. He had simply never made it the subject of a meeting, the way I had not. After lunch, we walked to his studio. The room smelled faintly of dust, steam, and cedar hangers. 2 dress forms stood near the windows under white cotton covers. A long work table occupied the center. Shelves held fabric rolls, boxes of buttons, and labeled envelopes of thread. Nothing looked abandoned exactly. It looked paused. Daniel removed the cover from one of the dress forms. A half-finished jacket was pinned to it, one sleeve attached and the other missing. "How long has that been there?" I asked. 11 months. "You remember exactly?" "I remember the day I stopped." He walked to the window and pushed it open a few inches. Cold air entered the room. "This was supposed to be part of my own collection," he said, "not for a client, not for Maya, just mine." "What happened?" "I decided it wasn't good enough." "Before or after you finished it?" He gave me a look. "Right," I said, difficult creative strategist. We took photographs and measured the available space. The campaign film would open there with a model uncovering a work table and beginning again without any dramatic speech about reinvention. Before we left, I stood near the unfinished jacket. "You should complete it," I said. Daniel put the cotton cover back over the dress form. "That isn't part of the project." "No." "Then don't turn it into copy." I wasn't going to. He studied me as if deciding whether to believe that. The train back to Boston was delayed by 40 minutes. We waited together beneath the station awning while rain struck the pavement in silver lines. Daniel checked the departure board. "You're going to miss your dinner." "I didn't have dinner plans." "You mentioned plans earlier." "I said I had to be back by 7. That usually implies plans." "I have laundry." He looked at me. An exclusive evening. Very difficult to get invited. When the train was announced, we walked to the platform. Daniel stopped before the stairs. "You have everything you need?" he asked. "For the location report?" "For the project." The question felt larger than the words. "Not yet," I said. His gaze held mine. People moved around us carrying umbrellas and overnight bags. The loudspeaker repeated the track number. "I'll see you Thursday," he said. "You could come Tuesday." "Maya can handle the review." "I know she can." The corner of his mouth lifted, but he still stepped back. "Have a good train ride, Noah." It was not a dramatic goodbye. He did not ask me to stay. I did not say the thing I had not yet admitted to myself. But when I sat by the window and watched him disappear behind the station columns, the empty seat beside me felt like evidence. That night, he sent me the addresses for the location report. Then he sent a photograph of the unfinished jacket with the cotton cover removed. No message. Just the photograph. I wrote, "Better already." He replied, "Nothing changed." I wrote, "You looked at it again." 3 dots appeared, vanished, and appeared once more. Finally, he sent, "Good night, Noah." The next morning, there was another message before I reached the office. "The left pocket is too high." I smiled at my phone on the subway. "Move it." His reply came immediately. "Bossy." Over the following week, our messages moved beyond the project by increments small enough to deny. He sent a photograph of the jacket's first sleeve. I sent campaign copy at midnight. He called to discuss it and stayed after we solved the sentence. We learned each other in fragments. His mother called every Sunday at 4. He loved detective novels, hated olives, and could not work while music had lyrics. My father mailed newspaper clippings, and my brother described me as the sibling who could explain fonts. "No one can explain fonts," I told Daniel. Our first call without a professional excuse came after I collected the last boxes from Rachel's sister. One contained wedding magazines and the notebook where we had listed reception songs. Daniel called that evening. "Is the jacket on fire?" I asked. "No. How was today?" I had not expected him to remember. Because he did, I told him about the notebook and how ending a relationship without betrayal gave me no clean anger to hide behind. "She still matters to you," he said. "She does, just not in the same way." "And you're sure ending it was right?" "Yes," the answer came easily. "Being sad doesn't mean it was wrong." "No," he said, "it doesn't." Then he told me he had moved the jacket pocket, and we stayed on the phone for another hour. The next week, during a late review at the Boston studio, Daniel became distant again. It happened after Julia stopped by our table and asked whether I planned to attend Rachel's birthday dinner with our old group of friends. I said I had not decided. Daniel did not react visibly, but 20 minutes later he began packing his materials before we had finished. "Are you leaving?" I asked. "I have an earlier train." "You always take the 8:40. I thought I'd take the 7:10. "Why?" He slid a sketch into his portfolio, "Because it leaves at 7:10. I looked around. Maya had already gone downstairs to meet a supplier. We were alone. Did I do something? No. You've barely looked at me since Julia came in. His hand stopped. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the radiator clicking near the windows. I thought it might be better if we kept things professional, he said. Things were professional. He gave me a look that said neither of us believed that anymore. I lowered my voice. What changed? You were engaged? I was. To a woman. It took me a second to understand what he was actually saying, then several weeks of careful distance rearranged themselves in my mind. Daniel, I said, I'm bisexual. His expression barely changed, but his shoulders lowered as if he had been holding them tense for days. Oh, that's all? What should I say? I don't know. You look like you were preparing to leave the country. I was preparing to take the 7:10. Because you thought I was straight. I thought you had recently planned a life with a woman. I did. And I didn't think it was appropriate to ask for a detailed history of everyone you might be attracted to. You could have asked me something. I don't ask people questions they may not want to answer. And I don't introduce myself with a relationship chart. His mouth moved, almost a smile, but the tension remained. I stepped closer to the table. Rachel knew from the beginning. I've dated men, I've dated women. The engagement ending had nothing to do with me suddenly discovering something about myself. I didn't think it did. Then what did you think? He looked down at the portfolio. That you weren't available, he said. I'm not engaged anymore. That isn't the same as being available. The sentence landed because it was fair. I crossed my arms. Are we still talking about work? No. Good, because I'm tired of having this conversation through train schedules. Daniel looked toward the windows, then back at me. His face had gone still in the way it did when he was trying not to reveal more than he intended. I like you, he said. There was no dramatic pause before it. He said it like a fact he had resisted and could no longer make useful by hiding. I know that may be inconvenient. I know you just ended something serious. I know we're working together. So I decided not to make it your problem. My heart beat hard enough that I felt it in my throat. You were doing a terrible job, I said. He blinked, at not making it my problem. A breath of laughter left him, but he still looked guarded. I like you too, I said. He searched my face. The relief I expected did not come. Instead, his expression became more careful. Noah. What? You ended an engagement 3 months ago. I'm aware. I don't want to be the first available person who makes you feel different from the life you almost chose. You're not. How do you know? Because I had been waiting for his messages. Because I noticed what train he took. Because an unfinished jacket in Providence had become part of my morning routine. Because I wanted to stand beside him at a work table and watch him lose track of 3 rectangles of fabric. But wanting someone was not the same as being ready to treat them well. I don't know how to prove it yet, I said. Daniel nodded once. That's the problem. He took the 8:40 train after all. We did not stop talking, but we changed the rules without formally agreeing on them. For the next 2 weeks, we kept our messages mostly about work. We did not call late at night. We did not create reasons to stay alone after meetings. The distance was responsible and miserable. It also clarified things. I had spent the months after the engagement assuming I needed to become completely untouched by sadness before I could care about someone else. But grief did not work like an apartment lease. One relationship did not have to be fully removed before another feeling was allowed to exist. What mattered was whether I was asking Daniel to repair something he had not broken. I started seeing a therapist again, not to prove anything to Daniel, but because his question exposed how often I confused self-awareness with action. I also met Rachel for coffee. She told me she was seeing someone. The news hurt, then settled into something quieter. I think I might want to see someone too, I said. Do you? Yes, but he asked if I was available and I realized I didn't know. Rachel stirred her coffee. You were always available in theory. That was part of the problem. Then she looked at me seriously. We didn't end because you couldn't love me. We ended because you kept hoping certainty would arrive before you had to choose. Don't do that to someone else. I'm trying not to. When we left, I felt sad and unexpectedly free. For the first time, freedom did not seem disrespectful to what we had lost. The campaign shoot took place over 3 long days in April. On the first morning, the photographer arrived before sunrise. Models changed behind temporary screens. Garment racks filled the studio. Maya moved through the chaos with 3 phones and a pencil clenched between her teeth. Daniel became someone else when the work began. He was calm, direct, and fully present. He adjusted hems, checked movement, and spoke to the models with a respect that made them visibly relax. When a seam pulled unexpectedly on one of the trousers, he knelt on the floor with a needle and repaired it in 4 minutes while everyone else debated whether to change the shot. Watching him work made the attraction feel almost secondary to admiration. Almost. At the Providence studio location, we filmed the opening sequence around the unfinished jacket. Daniel had completed the missing sleeve and moved the pocket. He had not told me. I stood beside the dress form while the crew adjusted the lights. You finished it. He checked the collar rather than looking at me. It needed to be done for the shot. The shot only required a jacket. This is a jacket. You know what I mean. His fingers smoothed the lapel. It's not perfect, he said. No. He looked at me. It's finished, I added. Something softened in his face. During lunch, I found him alone on the back stairs with a paper cup of coffee. I sat 1 step below him. You were good in there, I said. I repaired a seam. You made 30 people calmer. That sounds unlikely. It was noticeable. He turned the cup between his hands. I forgot I missed it. The stress? The part before the stress. When something exists outside my head and I can make it better. We sat in silence for a moment. I had coffee with Rachel, I said. Daniel's gaze moved to me, then away. How was that? Good, difficult, final in a way I think I needed. He nodded. I'm not telling you because I need credit for it, I said, and I'm not asking you to decide anything now. What are you telling me? That I'm trying to answer your question honestly. Which question? Whether I'm available. He studied my face. And? I think being available is a decision, not a condition that happens when nothing hurts anymore. Daniel looked down at the coffee cup. That sounds like campaign copy. It's too long. And a little self-important. Definitely not campaign copy then. He smiled. The assistant director called us back inside before either of us said more. The final day of the shoot ended at the train platform location. We photographed the rust coat against the blue-gray evening and filmed a model stepping off a train, pausing as the crowd moved around her, then continuing forward. After the crew packed up, Daniel and I stood beneath the platform lights while Maya signed the final paperwork. The project ends in 2 weeks, he said. We still have editing, launch copy, and the client presentation. 2 weeks, he repeated. I heard what he was asking. Have dinner with me Friday, I said. We have dinner after the edit review. Not with the team, not about work. A train moved past us, filling the air with wind and noise. Daniel's coat shifted against his legs. When the platform became quiet again, he asked, "Are you asking me on a date?" "Yes." He looked almost amused. "You could have used the word." "I wanted to be certain." "That's new. I'm developing." He looked toward Maya, who was still talking with the station manager, then back at me. "One date," he said. "That sounds like a warning." "It's a number." Friday. Friday. Our first deliberate date took place in Providence because Daniel said I had already made him travel to Boston enough. He chose a small restaurant near College Hill with 12 tables and no music loud enough to rescue us from silence. I arrived early. He arrived exactly on time, wearing the navy coat and a dark sweater that made his eyes look warmer than I remembered. For the first 10 minutes, we talked like colleagues, pretending not to know each other. We discussed the edit. We discussed Maya's refusal to approve a photograph because a chair leg looked emotionally uncertain. We discussed the weather. Finally, Daniel put down his glass. "This is terrible." The food? The conversation? I was giving you time to become interesting, to relax. I was relaxed until you started discussing cloud cover. I laughed. "Fine, ask me something you wouldn't ask in a meeting." He considered it. "Have you ever been in love with a man?" The directness surprised me, though I had invited it. "Yes." "How long ago?" "College. His name was Ben. We were together a year and a half." "What happened?" "He moved to California. I didn't want to follow. We tried long distance until every call became a review of how badly long distance was going." Daniel nodded. "And after him?" "Men and women. Nothing long enough to require a moving truck until Rachel." "I wasn't asking for proof." "I know, but I understand why you're careful." He looked down at the table. "It isn't because you're bisexual," he said. "I want you to know that." "I do." "It's because I don't want to be private." The word stayed between us. "My last boyfriend wasn't out to his family," he continued. "I told myself it didn't matter. Then 3 years passed, and I was still introduced as his friend at every holiday. I'm not doing that again." "I'm out." "To who?" "My family, my friends. Rachel, some people at work." "Some." "I don't make announcements, but I don't lie." "That isn't exactly the same as being visible." I wanted to defend myself. Instead, I thought of the agency conversations Daniel had heard, all of them constructing a complete story from my engagement to a woman. I had never corrected anyone because nothing they said had been false. But omission could still create a room someone else had to stand outside. "I don't want to hide you," I said. "We've had one date." "I know. You don't have to promise anything tonight." "I'm not promising. I'm telling you what I won't ask you to accept." His expression softened. After dinner, we walked through the cold along Benefit Street. The sidewalks were uneven and old houses rose close to the road. Daniel kept his hands in his coat pockets. I wanted to touch him, but the conversation had made every gesture feel meaningful. At his corner, we stopped beneath a street lamp. "I had a good time," I said, after the cloud discussion. That was my strongest material. He smiled. For a second, neither of us moved. I could have asked to kiss him. I wanted to. But wanting to prove I was decisive was not the same as listening to the pace we had agreed on. "Good night, Daniel." His eyes held mine, and I saw surprise, then understanding. "Good night, Noah." On the train home, he texted me, "Thank you for not turning tonight into a test." I wrote back, "I considered giving you a written evaluation." His reply came a moment later, "Your restraint is inspiring." The date changed us without resolving us. We went out again the following week, this time for coffee after an edit session. Then we met on a Sunday at a used bookstore, where Daniel spent 20 minutes searching for a mystery novel his mother had mentioned. We still worked together, but the professional boundary no longer required pretending there was nothing on the other side of it. At the agency, I stopped allowing people to narrate my life inaccurately through habit. It did not require a speech. When Julia asked whether I was bringing anyone to Elise's birthday dinner, I said, "Maybe. I've been seeing a man in Providence." She blinked once, then asked, "The designer? Is everyone observant except me?" "Yes," she said, "it's becoming a concern." Elise's birthday dinner happened 3 days before the campaign launch. Daniel almost declined because he had a final fitting, then arrived late with rain in his hair and apologized to everyone at the table. I stood when I saw him. "This is Daniel," I said to the 2 colleagues who had not met him. "He's my date, and he designed the collection we're all pretending not to panic about." Daniel looked at me. The introduction was simple. No one applauded. No one asked a difficult question. Julia moved her bag so he could sit beside me. Under the table, Daniel's knee touched mine and stayed there. Later, outside the restaurant, he said, "You didn't have to do that." "Call you my date?" "You know what I mean." "I said I wouldn't ask you to be private." He looked down the street, where the wet pavement reflected the traffic lights. "I believed you," he said, "but—" It was still good to hear. The launch took place in a converted warehouse near the harbor. Garments hung from suspended rails. The campaign film played across a white wall. Photographs from the train platform in Daniel's studio were printed at almost life-size scale. The room filled quickly. Buyers, local press, clients, friends, and people who seemed professionally skilled at holding one drink for 3 hours moved through the space. Maya wore one of Daniel's rust jackets and changed her mind about the lighting 9 minutes before the doors opened. Elise gave a short speech. I stood near the projection wall and watched strangers read words I had written about change, return, and living inside a life that fit differently. Daniel disappeared into the crowd. I found him 40 minutes later in the back hallway near the freight elevator. He was alone, leaning against the wall with his eyes closed. "Are you hiding?" I asked. He opened his eyes, temporarily. "People love the collection." That seems statistically unlikely. Maya has already shown me 6 emails. She shows everyone emails. 3 stores asked about orders. His face changed. 3. He looked toward the noise of the event. I thought I would feel more certain. About the collection. About coming back. You don't have to decide tonight. I know. I stood beside him against the wall. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. "The first night we worked alone," he said, "when you told me I was nervous." I remember. It felt like there was a ball of fire sitting in the middle of my chest. I turned toward him. He gave a short, embarrassed laugh. "I'm aware that sounds dramatic." "A little." I couldn't remember where the fabric went. You were standing too close, and I was trying not to make it obvious that I wanted you to stay there. I stayed. I noticed. The hallway seemed suddenly quieter, though the music and voices were still only a few feet away. Daniel looked at me with none of the distance he had used to protect us both. "I haven't stopped thinking about you since that night," he said, "even when I was trying to." I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding. "I keep finding reasons to talk to you," I said. I kept pretending the reasons were the project. "The project is over. Then I need new reasons." His smile was small and unsteady. "I don't want to rush you," he said. "You're not. I don't want you to say yes because you're afraid of losing something again. I'm saying yes because I want this, not because it's painless, not because I know exactly what it becomes, because I want to find out with you." He searched my face one last time. I stepped closer, leaving enough space for him to move if he wanted. "Can I kiss you?" I asked. "Yes." The answer was immediate. I touched one hand lightly to his arm and kissed him. It was brief, warm, and softer than the weeks of tension that had led to it. When we separated, his forehead rested against mine for a moment. Someone pushed open the warehouse door at the end of the hallway, and a burst of conversation reached us. Daniel smiled. "We should go back." "Probably." Neither of us moved. "People will look for you," he said. "They've been doing that all night. And Maya will assume you're fixing the projection. She thinks I can fix technology because I know where the power button is." He laughed, then took my hand. We returned to the launch together. The first months of our relationship were not a smooth continuation of the campaign. Without the project calendar, we had to decide when to see each other instead of allowing meetings to decide for us. Daniel came to Boston most Thursdays. I went to Providence on weekends. We learned which train was usually late, which grocery store near his apartment stayed open past 10, and how many shirts I could leave in his closet before it became a conversation. We also learned that attraction did not automatically make our habits compatible. I filled silence when I was nervous. Daniel became quieter. I made plans weeks in advance. He preferred to decide after checking how tired he felt. I answered work emails during dinner. He disappeared into the studio for 6 hours without telling anyone where he had gone. Our first real argument happened in July. Daniel had planned to spend a weekend in Boston, but a difficult sample kept delaying him. Saturday morning became afternoon, then he canceled at 4. "You knew yesterday that you were behind," I said when I called. "I thought I could finish." "The point is I planned around you." His voice went flat. "I'm sorry." I recognized the door closing. Don't agree just to end the conversation. Every answer I give makes you more upset. We ended the call with both of us speaking too carefully. The next morning, I took the train to Providence, then had enough sense to text before appearing at his studio. He told me to come. "I need you to tell me when plans change," I said. "Not because I own your time, because I'm building a life that includes you." Daniel looked at the failed sample on the dress form. "When I'm behind, I think I can fix everything if everyone leaves me alone long enough." "I can leave you alone. I just need to know that's what's happening." He nodded. "I'm sorry I made you wait. I'm sorry I turned one missed weekend into a referendum on us. That was a little intense. And I need to stop answering emails during dinner." "Yes. You could pretend to consider that." "I considered it weeks ago." I laughed. We worked quietly at opposite ends of the table until 6, when he put down his pencil and held out his hand. We walked to dinner. By autumn, alder and ash had sold enough of the collection to fund another season. Maya offered Daniel the role of creative director. He refused the full-time title and proposed something smaller: 2 limited collections a year, a 4-day schedule, and the freedom to take independent work. To everyone's surprise except mine, Maya agreed. She only argued for 20 minutes, Daniel told me over the phone. Practically surrender. She wants to lease a larger studio. In Providence. Boston? I sat up on my couch. Because of production? Partly. Their new manufacturer is north of the city. Most of the wholesale meetings are there. Maya thinks it makes sense. And what do you think? I think commuting 3 days a week would be exhausting. My chest tightened, but I kept my voice even. You don't have to take it. I know. We were quiet, then he said, I've been looking at apartments. In Boston. Yes. The word opened a door I had been careful not to touch. Daniel, are you moving for the job? I'm considering moving because I want the job. Most of my work is shifting there, and the person I'm in love with already lives there. It was the first time either of us had used the word love. I stood in the middle of my living room, holding the phone against my ear. You can't say that in the middle of a sentence about commuting. I just did. You're in love with me? That was the relevant part. Yes. He exhaled, and I could hear the smile in it. Yes, Noah? I closed my eyes. I love you too. This time, certainty did not arrive before the choice. I said it while I was still afraid of changing too much, while I still remembered the life I had nearly built, while I knew Daniel and I could hurt each other through ordinary failures of attention. It felt more honest that way. We did not move in together immediately. Daniel rented a small apartment 10 minutes from his new studio and kept the Providence workspace through the end of the year. We wanted the move to belong to his career as much as it belonged to us. 3 months later, when my lease came up, we began looking for a place together. We chose a third-floor apartment with uneven floors, a narrow kitchen, and enough light in the second bedroom for Daniel to use it as a small home workroom. It was not the largest place we saw. It was the first one where neither of us began by explaining what would have to change. On moving day, Rachel sent me a message wishing us luck. Daniel read it over my shoulder only because I handed him the phone. "She seems kind," he said. "She is? Are you okay?" I looked around the room at half-open boxes, garment bags, books, and a coffee maker we could not find the filters for. "Yes," I said, and I was. Almost a year after Daniel walked into my conference room carrying Maya's portfolio, Alder and Ash returned to the agency to plan its next fall campaign. We booked the same room by accident. I arrived first and found Daniel arranging fabric samples across the table. He now carried his own portfolio. The jacket he had left unfinished for 11 months hung on the back of his chair. Maya texted that she was running late because a supplier call had gone badly. Daniel looked at the message and shook his head. Apparently, I'm still her emergency replacement. Worked out pretty well the first time. He placed a cream swatch beside a dark blue one, frowned, and moved it 2 inches to the left. Then he moved it back. I walked around the table and stopped beside him. "You're getting nervous," I said. He looked up at me, smiling before I finished the sentence. "Not anymore." I leaned closer. "You moved that fabric twice. The composition is difficult. It's 2 rectangles. That's why every decision matters." The conference room door opened before I could answer. Maya entered with 3 coffees and an apology already prepared. Daniel reached beneath the table and took my hand for one brief second before the meeting began. The first time we had sat in that room, I had thought my life was something I could manage by answering every question carefully enough. I had believed certainty was a requirement for choosing, grief was evidence that I should stand still, and love would become safe if I waited until there was nothing left to risk. I had been wrong about all of it. Daniel released my hand and opened his portfolio. Maya began talking. I looked at the new sketches, at the notes in his handwriting, and at the man beside me who no longer tried to disappear from his own work. Then I opened my notebook and started writing.